Well, good afternoon. My name is not Laura Green. It is actually Uta Poiger, and I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. And it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you this afternoon and then to hand over to Dean Green in just a moment. This is really great, I have to say, for us to actually be in a physical room together and at the same time to know that some of you are joining us via live stream. And what you can see is yet a new incarnation of the Undergraduate Research Forum, which has a long tradition in CSSH. 2 years ago, we pivoted quickly to an online format, and it's really, really nice that this year we can do some of the work that we are doing in person again, while also having the benefit of having more people who might have a harder time joining us on campus in this room right now join us as well. You know also from looking at the program that this is very much a forum that is in the Northeastern spirit, that is taking challenging questions, complex questions, analyzing them thoroughly, but also thinking about solutions. And that is so much the spirit that I so admire of all of you students and the collaborations that you have with one another, as well as with our faculty members. So without further ado, let me turn over to Associate Dean Green. Welcome to all of you in the audience, and I very much look forward to the presentations and especially the discussion. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody in the room, and hello, everybody out there in space listening in. We're so happy to have both of you. I do not need to add to the framing that Dean Poiger has so nicely set out, so I'm going to confine myself to some important housekeeping details. First of all, there have been a couple of changes to the very nice program, so please, if you did not take one as a keepsake on your way out. But for the most up-to-date version of the program, please visit the CSSH website, navigate to Undergraduate Research Forum, and you will find the most up-to-date version of the program there. We do have one speaker who could not be with us today at the very end of the program, so we have a little more time. But don't go overboard with it. I know you've all practiced your presentations and will come in beautifully in your time. I've noticed that Northeastern students are actually really good at following those kinds of instructions, so much appreciation ahead of time. Let me just remind people what the choreography will be, and again, this is to accommodate our listeners and viewers online. Your moderator will be standing at this podium speaking into this microphone and will introduce everybody at once or as you wish. The person who is speaking will come up, grab this microphone, and actually I know you guys are going first, right? So I'm just going to walk over right now, breaking the fourth wall, and hand you that microphone. It is on. You will, whoever is speaking will stand to one side, either side of the screen while doing the presentation. There is a clicker at the podium. When your moderator has finished introducing you, you can let him know whether you would like to do your own clicking, in which case he will give it to you, or we can hand it off to Jen Grieve, who can click through the slides for you. If you want her to do it, you'll just say next slide when you are ready for the next slide. So, does everyone feel like the instructions are clear? Awesome, thank you. So I am now very pleased to introduce the moderator of our first panel, my colleague Amir Carbareto, who is a professor of political science and international affairs, who is the interim director of international affairs, and who is the chair of the Culture, Societies, and Global Studies Department, and yet he has managed to take some time to come and moderate our first panel. So Amílcar, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making the appearance, and it's wonderful to see live people again. The first panel first presentation is How Far I'll Go, Social Infrastructure Accessibility and Proximity in Urban Neighborhoods. And today there are three presenters, if I'm not mistaken for that paper: Olivia Feeley, Kelly Gilmore and Andres Rich. Will you please come up?
So yes, thank you everyone for coming. This is our research project entitled How Far I'll Go. We're analyzing social infrastructure, accessibility, and proximity in urban neighborhoods. So our two guiding research questions so far have been, what kinds of social infrastructure are easier to access than others? And how does access to social infrastructure differ in neighborhoods depending on the socioeconomic, racial, and ethnic backgrounds of these communities due to a legacy of systemic disenfranchisement? So this is important because, especially in recent memory, the COVID-19 pandemic has placed a considerable amount of stress and duress on communities all over the nation, especially here in Boston, which is where we're focusing on because it's pretty accessible to us. And it's especially harmful to communities of a lower socioeconomic status. Analyzing social infrastructure can help to determine which communities are most resilient, or rather, which communities are most at risk of falling apart during these types of crises. Previous work has shown that walkability, adequate green space, proper land use, and sufficient community centers all have beneficial effects on the resilience and interconnectedness of these communities, and thus their ability to adapt to crises. Types of social infrastructure can have different effects, and we'll break down the subdivisions that our project breaks down social infrastructure in a bit. In general, previous work has shown that more social infrastructure and higher quality social infrastructure boosts the resilience of a community, which is good because it boosts their ability to adapt during crises. So what we're doing is we break down social infrastructure in the city of Boston by analyzing different neighborhoods across the city, because as you know, in Boston, many different neighborhoods have different histories and different communities, and we're breaking these down into four broad categories. The first is social businesses, which you can think of as cafes and other crossing of roads. Religious, churches and mosques, parks, which I think is pretty clear what those are, and community centers. You can think of gyms or mental health centers for that. By exploring the effects that each type of social infrastructure has on a community, broken down by its subtype, and the number of that amount of type in each community, and the proximity of each of those types of social infrastructure to buildings in their community, we hope to put forth some sort of findings that could help to develop future policy in city and urban planning. What's the best way to plan a city to maximize the livelihood of its residents? That's what we want to answer.
So to collect the quantitative data for our research question, we use the custom mapping tool Google My Maps to create a map of the entire city of Boston that is divided into a grid of 168 polygon cells that are each 1 kilometer squared. The Google Maps Places API program was then used to map an initial sample of 1,208 social infrastructure sites within each grid that are individually verified and classified into parks, community spaces, social businesses, and places of worship. A random sample of 10 city blocks were checked for these sites in person. The association between API sites, online check sites, and sites checked in person was very strong, indicating that the correct sites were located. Researchers, through online verification, added and classified a total of 2,133 sites of social infrastructure in the city of Boston. We created maps of each cell to visualize the layout of social infrastructure within each cell using the SF package in RStudio. We did this to visually conceptualize the layout of our case study's social infrastructure, as well as the layout of each cell in Boston. We also calculated the average distance from any building in each cell to each social infrastructure site to gain a better understanding of accessibility. We did this through RStudio by measuring the linear distance between each building and all surrounding social infrastructure sites. We then compiled these distances into a data set which we used to calculate the mean distance from any given building to each social infrastructure type. Another measurement we took to further understand accessibility was calculating the percentage of buildings that were within 100 feet of each social infrastructure type. We filtered our data set, which contained all of the linear distances, down to instances where the distance between a building and a social infrastructure site was less than 100 feet. We then grouped these remaining distances by social infrastructure type, so park, community space, etc., and using the total number of buildings in each cell, calculated the percent of buildings within 100 feet of each of these sites. As a third measurement, we also measured the frequency of all 4 types of social infrastructure sites by totaling the number of each site instances, and this provided us with a comparative perspective between frequency and accessibility in social infrastructure types.
So for some practical application, we put some of our findings into some case studies. So I conducted a case study on a cell in the Back Bay area, which, as many of us know, is a primarily residential area, pretty wealthy, lots of brownstones. It encompasses part of the Charles River Esplanade, as well as Boston Common, as well as part of Newbury Street, so a commercial hub. And as a result, we expected that there would be parks and social businesses as the most accessible types of social infrastructure. And interestingly, what we found was that 45% of our buildings were within 100 feet of a place of worship. So this is evidence of a lot of those churches that are clustered on those residential streets. And we also can see a pretty drastic overrepresentation of social infrastructure in this cell. You can see the counts on the slide of 300 plus places of individual types of social infrastructure, which was not mirrored in any of our other case studies.
So I conducted a case study in the Dorchester area of Boston, specifically the Mount Bowdoin neighborhood, which includes some parks and a main road. So because of that, we expected a high number of social businesses, and because of the layout of parks within the neighborhood, we expected there to be fewer parks and community spaces that were accessible. However, in reality, we found that parks and places of worship were the most frequently found types of social infrastructure and were also the most accessible, with a combined total of 56% of the buildings in the cell being within 100 feet of either a park or a place of worship. Interestingly, however, we also found that social businesses, though less frequent, are actually more accessible on average to all buildings within the cell, with an average of 900 feet between a building and a social business.
The last case study we'd like to highlight is in Nubian Square, which we expected social businesses to be the most frequent and the most central, based on an initial overview of the area and our own preconceived notions on the area. What we found, however, was that parks were actually the most frequent and the most central in the area. What this showed us is not only how Boston is planned as a city throughout all its neighborhoods, but also that our first impressions of an area and what we think of the area doesn't necessarily reflect the reality on the ground.
So to make sense of these findings, our primary finding, and a lot of our case studies are emblematic of these, was that buildings in neighborhoods of color are generally located further from community spaces and places of worship. This was our Mount Bowdoin example that we just referenced as a great example, and this remained pretty consistent even after controlling for socioeconomics, public transit, and building traits in that area. Our second finding, which is a very significant one, is that wealth correlates with access to social businesses and parks. And Back Bay is a great example. We witnessed the overrepresentation of those social infrastructure types, 300 plus, when our other groups did not even break 15. And our third finding was that access to transit does not guarantee access to social infrastructure. And this could be because access to transit allows us to access places further away that are maybe outside of the realm of your general walkable block. So this could imply that we won't necessarily combat a lack of infrastructure by expanding transit, but rather we really need to invest in these specific communities. And our final finding was that demographics and socioeconomics explain more variation than desired. So they explain 14% of the total variation in proximity to social infrastructure. And that's significant. It's too much. And it's really evidence of the fact that practices of redlining and systemic racism are very deeply entrenched in our city and the way that it is planned and laid out. And they really inform who has access to certain resources. And so the next steps or potential takeaways from this project, we hope that our research can contribute to a discussion about city planning and where to invest resources and identifying those problems that we need to tackle collectively as a community. Thank you so much.
And our next presentation is Better Together, the role of social capital in urban social vulnerability. Nicole, please. Nicole Naquin.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming here to this presentation. I'm going to be presenting on some work that I did last summer on the role of social capital in urban social vulnerability. Now, I don't know if you could really tell a lot from just the title alone, because not many people may be familiar with the concept of social capital. So, what exactly is social capital? Social capital is basically just a measure of relationships between people. And in social sciences, we like to distinguish between the different types of interpersonal relationships. In this study, we talk about 3 different types of social capital. One of them is bonding. These are in-group ties among people who share some demographic similarities. These are people in the same age groups, people who have the same religion, people who share the same ethnic background, and because of these similarities, will likely be coming in contact with one another naturally. There's bridging social capital. These connections are made to connect people of different social groups who may not necessarily come into contact with each other more naturally. So bridging social capital can be created through community centers or through even like hobby clubs and sports clubs and things like that. Lastly, there is linking social capital, and that social capital examines connections between authority and the governed. So it would be connections between the general population and the police, firefighters, and government officials. So, our research question is, why are some communities more vulnerable to natural disasters, and is there a connection between social capital and vulnerability? What we do in this study is we're looking at disaster relief and disaster prevention and recovery, and we're trying to see how we can utilize social connections to make these communities more stronger and more resilient against these natural disasters. We specifically use Japan as a case study, and specifically the terrible 2011 earthquake that happened. The variety of time that we look at is between 2000 and 2017, so we're able to look at how social capital changes before and after this terrible event. We hypothesized that increasing measures of social capital, all forms of social capital, would decrease overall vulnerability. We thought it was rather inherent that having strong connections in any sort of way would help people better overcome and better handle these sorts of natural disasters. In our research, what we did was we used a differences in differences model. And basically what it is, it treats a variable as a treatment over time. What we did was we were able to quantify these sorts of different relationships, interpersonal relationships. And you may be wondering, how can you possibly measure or quantify like friendships or things like that? What we did was we got the density and the number of community centers, schools, the different sorts of facilities that can help facilitate and grow these connections, and we use them as proxies for these sorts of social connections. We did this for bonding, bridging, and linking capital, and what we did was we used this as a treatment over time to measure social vulnerability, or the resilience of a community to these natural disasters based on social factors. So what I'm saying, for example, is social vulnerability could mean having a larger percentage of a city's population be elderly or very young. It could increase social vulnerability because they may need extra help in terms of an evacuation. And for our controls, we use these just to make sure that every city, whether it was Tokyo or a much smaller one, was treated equally. And our findings were really interesting. We actually found that the only type of social capital that really had a significant impact on social vulnerability was bonding social capital. So social capital that was in-group. We find that bridging and linking didn't have any significant relationship with social vulnerability over time. And when me and my research partner reflected on this, we actually thought that it sort of made sense if we look at it in terms of how we handled COVID. when in the immediate time in March 2020, when everybody was starting to quarantine, everybody was going home, trying to get supplies, we always turned to our family. We turned to those people immediately close to us to try to help us with our immediate needs. And we find that this is most likely why bonding social capital was the most significant and had a negative relationship with vulnerability over time. And we think that this has major implications not only for disaster relief policy, but also for a lot of other community building policy. We think that communities, in order to prevent terrible effects of natural disasters, could try to make sure that people of the same group have places to meet. They could organize neighborhood block parties, elderly home events, things like that. But the important thing is that these people are given designated times and places to meet. So this would mean having specific places to worship for people of the same religious group, things like that. And for my personal studies, I plan to go get a master's in development studies, and this is really inspiring my future research that I hope to do in community-driven development efforts and seeing how social bonds can help with these development projects. Thank you so much for listening.
Said, if I can just pipe up, Amílcar, that we will have time for questions at the end of every panel. So please do be collecting those questions in your mind.
Thank you. The next presentation, Unlikely Refugee, India as a Safe Haven for Jewish Refugees, ? Trissha Sivalingam, please. And
Thank you. All right. Oh, I should be able to say. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your time today. So my research question and my paper was inspired by an article headline I saw published in The Juggernaut, which is a news and story database on South Asian culture, history, and politics. And its tagline, captures your attention instantly. The Jews of India, what makes India one of the safest places for Jews in the world? And like all good journalism, it was blocked by a paywall, so I had to find the answer out on my own. And I did this research project under Professor William Miles, who's researching Holocaust awareness on the Global South. So I was trying to find a connection between Jewish history and Indian history. So essentially, why is India so safe for Jewish refugees? What has been their role in Indian history, politics, and culture? And it starts during the partition of India. Today, we understand partition as the official end of British colonialism in India and the partition of India and Pakistan into separate states for their respective religious groups. It was fueled by centuries of religious differences and political animosity. However, the factors that influenced the partition, that physically separated Hindus and Muslims, was heavily impacted by Jewish refugees, unintentionally and indirectly. So, to better understand the current political state of India and its Jewish citizens, I posed the following research question. What was the influence of Jewish refugees on the 1947 partition of India, and how did Jewish refugees affect, both politically and socially, the Indian government and religious tensions between Hindus and Muslims during this time period and even in modern times? To explore this question, I researched primary sources, texts, and first-hand accounts of Hindu, Muslim, and Jewish experiences, and will provide a few examples of the indirect influences that I found. So, take British colonialization, for example. The arrival of the British in India took away power from Indian Muslims of the Mughal Empire who had ruled India up until then. Deep religious divides between Hindus and Muslims were solidified by the British through taxes and job postings. Hindus were also in areas that the British colonized first, such as southern India, and were more receptive to Western culture and teaching. However, partition overlapped with the movement for Indian independence, and in 1947, British animosity was running high in the country. It's important to recognize that while Indians had differing reactions to the Holocaust and the suffering of Jewish peoples, they were preoccupied with their struggle against British colonial rule. Primary Indian efforts were directed towards ending colonial rule through protest, revolution, and political strategy, seen in Gandhi's Salt March on the top left. While many prominent figures sympathized with Jews fleeing persecution, many also saw Jewish people as allies of the British who were fighting the Germans. So advocates of the Indian liberation movement including Gandhi, were not exactly the fondest of helping their British allies, i.e., Jewish refugees. While legislation was being debated to allow Jewish refugees into the country, anti-British sentiment was thus inflamed, and further expedited the process of partition and inflamed the desire to have the British out of India. Hindu and Muslim animosity was also heavily influenced by these debates about whether or not Jewish refugees should be allowed into India. Indian Muslim officials opposed allowing Jewish refugees into India as they feared that Jews could displace them in Indian society as they believed what had been done to Arabs in what had eventually become Israel. This resulted in a specialized and small group of Jewish immigrants allowed in the country who were experts in their fields, ranging from art and music composition to medicine and education, which is a whole nother rabbit hole of fascinating research about the current Jewish communities of India. However, this allotment of even a few refugees caused a dramatic push from Indian Muslims who wanted greater dominance and representation in the government to entirely cast out potential Jewish refugees they feared would take their place in society. The presence of refugees sparked a greater debate for Muslim representation and led to pushes for an independent Muslim state rather than one shared with Indian Hindus for fear of Hindu majoritarianism in the government. In the famous photo on the right, you see Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who eventually became the founder of Pakistan, and Gandhi, who are seemingly in debate over statehood and partition. So just the political associations alone of Jewish refugees increased political animosity between these two religious groups, and we can see how that influenced different calls for separate states. The largest example of Jewish influence on partition, however, was due to the influence of Hitler's nationalist ideology of national purity and ethnic cleansing. The most devastating impact of Jewish refugee presence was that they became proof that nation-state ideology and the fascist experiment it had inspired had tangible results that forced Jewish refugees out of Germany and out of Europe. For Hindu and Muslim nationalists, this served as the greatest influence in promoting partition ideology for the independent states of Pakistan and India. The timing of the Holocaust paralleled dangerous and dark separatist ideology in India that was fueled by Hitler. V.D. Savarkar, an extremely prominent Indian nationalist and revered freedom fighter who advocated for partition, said at the time, "A nation is formed by a majority living therein. What did the Jews do in Germany? They, being in the minority, were driven out of Germany." Having seen its success firsthand, nationalists directly used Hitler's ideologies of fascism and discriminatory cleansing to support their ideas. This mindset of an India with a homogeneous religion became a common ideology held by Hindu nationalists who defended movements to drive out Indian Muslims. In the photo on the bottom left, you can see Subhas Chandra Bose, the founder of the Indian Army and the one who led the Indian Liberation Army against the British, shaking hands with Hitler, and he often said that he admired Hitler for his military tactics in driving out the Jews in Germany and Europe. In this process of fleeing religious persecution, Jewish refugees inadvertently proved to Hindu and Muslim extremists that religious cleansing was achievable through nationalist agendas, further inflaming the tension of partition. And it should not be underestimated how deep fascist influence pervaded India. It shaped nationalist culture and patriotic ideals in ways that continue to negatively impact Indians today through the current ruling party, the BJP. And while this was a complex time period to tackle, dealing with Indian independence, partition, the Holocaust, colonization, and much, much more, there were a few important takeaways from this paper that I cannot stress enough. The first being, Jewish refugees were in no way responsible for the resulting conflict between Muslims and Indians and Hindus in India. A fascinating lens I learned about through this paper was the role of cultural agency. By attributing the religious tensions between these two groups to British colonization and third-party actors, we erase the agency they have over their own history, as well as their cultural differences. It is undeniable the influence of these actors, but the root of religious tensions and the root of partition can be attributed to a simpler origin. Different histories and cultural practices have distinguished Hindus and Muslims from each other since Islam was introduced to the Indian subcontinent. The next is tackling the information hidden behind the juggernaut paywall. Many academic and current sources claim that India may be the only country in the world that has been free of anti-Semitic prejudice throughout its history. While we know this is not true historically, it is true that modern-day India doesn't have room for anti-Semitism in it. After World War II, Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria who permanently settled in India joined smaller pre-existing groups that have seemingly flourished in India with no religious tensions or fear of persecution, according to numerous first-hand accounts, and they live in India side by side but not submerged, acculturated but not assimilated. Jews in India have been able to blend with Indian culture through language and tradition without fear of forced conversion or loss of their way of life. In comparison to other countries, it is evident why India is viewed as one of the safest countries for Jewish people today. But does this lack of anti-Semitism translate to active support of Judaism and Jewish peoples? This is harder to discern in India. In the photo, we have Prime Minister Narendra Modi and former Jewish Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who maintained a strong relationship, politically speaking. But we have to wonder how far this relationship goes. The Jewish population of India has remained so small throughout history that they have never been considered to be a political threat. So, as far as current ruling parties in India are concerned, Jewish citizens do not pose any opposition to them. Furthermore, with Jewish people's emphasis on religious freedom and the desire to preserve their own culture and religion, there have been no efforts to convert Indians to Judaism or heavily assimilate into Indian society. In that sense, Indians have not openly welcomed Jewish people, but in reality have simply not been bothered by them. So this paper allowed me to look into a very under-researched part of history that deals with one of the most complex intersections of religious conflict in modern history. However, it's proof that the modern world is no longer isolated, and all our interpersonal and cultural communication and interactions are connected in a broader picture that shapes our history and future. Thank you.
Let's see. For Q&A, I would like to invite all the presenters today to come forward. I think that'll be easier. And then we can pass the microphone.
You just leave the mic.
You don't need it.
Okay.
Shall we cluster on either side of the screen? So let's have a few of you
Yeah,
on
should we?
Yeah. Well, okay. All right. Awesome. Can I start?
Please.
I have so many questions. Thank you for 3 wonderful papers. Really interesting work that students are doing on the vulnerabilities of populations in a really in a broad set of circumstances. And my question, I thought there was an intriguing connection between the first 2 papers that I was hoping might be explored a little. And so the general question is, what is the connection between social infrastructure, which is to say stuff, right, parks, buildings, et cetera, and social capital, right, the bonds that Nicole was describing. And Nicole, there actually was a moment in your paper where I thought you said that you used social infrastructure as a proxy for social capital, but yes. I may have misunderstood that. But so I would like to invite both groups to comment on the relationships, if you have thoughts about them, between social infrastructure, the stuff, and social capital, the relationships.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think probably the clearest connection between our projects is that they're both advised by Professor Tim Fraser.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, there you go.
So there definitely are a lot of overlapping themes, but I think as far as social infrastructure, I think it definitely can be a conduit for those bonds between people. Places of worship bring together people of a like faith. Parks might bring together people of similar interests who may not necessarily belong to the same in-groups. The same goes for social businesses. Perhaps you all enjoy coffee, but you come from different parts of the city. I don't know if you want to elaborate.
Yeah, totally. One part of the paper that we really stress is that these meetings that happen to strengthen forms of social capital need to be happening frequently, and they need to be happening ideally in designated areas for them to happen, and that, of course, is social infrastructure. So these interrelate quite well.
Thank you. Other questions?
I just was wondering whether each of you would say a little bit more about your research processes to let us in a little bit more. You certainly said quite a bit in your presentations already. I'm curious also if the 3 of you who collaborated would want to say a few words about collaboration in that context, but I would also love to hear just from each of you about what the kind of data was that you were able to gather, how long you've been working on these really interesting conclusions that you have now drawn from the evidence that you have gathered. So interested in just getting a bit more into the research processes, basically.
Yeah, I can. A lot of my research was looking through online archives of published newspaper clippings, and there's actually very, very little research being done on the current Jewish communities of India, but it's a rapidly growing field, which was really exciting to look into. But there's a lot of cumulative works publishing firsthand accounts of Jewish refugees coming into India, and also really prominent Indian figures at the time, like the Prime Minister, Gandhi, etc., people like that, who were very vocal about their political opinions on refugees coming in. So a lot of just first-hand accounts and primary source analysis.
Most all of our data came from Japanese census data that is publicly available, and I find it super cool what you can do with just census data. That's actually what Dr. Fraser used for the basis of his social capital indices. And we did usual multivariate regression to handle controls and everything. And he introduced me as well to the differences in differences model. I'd never used that before, but I thought it was really fun. And this all happened in the span of like maybe 4 months last summer. Yeah.
We had a really cool experience. We're all actually former classmates. We all came together in a quantitative techniques class along with 3 of our other classmates. So we're actually representative of a bigger team of 6 of us who worked on this project. I started working on the project in an early phase when we were going out into the field and checking to make sure all of these different social infrastructure sites were legitimate, because we were working from a Google kind of resource. And then we came together to start working on the later phases of the project. I don't know if you guys want to talk about that at all.
Yeah, we started working together in mid-January, and we all were assigned our different case studies. So we actually each have like a separate partner who's not here. So we all worked on different neighborhoods, but we were able to do a bunch of different analyses using our studio with some of the techniques we learned in a previous class.
Yeah, it is funny how it lined up, because we were all partnered with someone who couldn't be here today, so we were all able to talk about our own respective work. But yeah, it was really interesting, because I think a lot of it for me was figuring out how, and for the team, was figuring out how to present the data in the most graspable way, especially when it came to proximity, because it seems like a very obvious concept, like, oh, these buildings are close to, these types of social infrastructure. We also had a conversation about the quality of social infrastructure, because when you think of a park, you might think of a huge green field, but a lot of the parks, especially when you're in the South Boston, most people probably wouldn't call those parks, but they are parks, and they can be a place for social capital to be built, but they're much smaller than what we have, up here on Fenway. Fens is great, but they're much smaller parks. So it's interesting to have those conversations about how do we present this data in a way where it's more ambivalent, and how do we present it in a way that's easy to grasp and understand and not misinterpret.
I also just wanted to add that I also met Tim through the quantitative techniques class. So it just goes to show what one quant class could do.
It's a great gateway to research.
That's great. I'm not sure everyone knows that, or that people would grasp it just from the title of the class, right?
Yeah.
That's such an opportunity.
I'm actually in quantitative techniques. All of this is I actually understand what they're talking about.
It's the gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah.
Can I sneak in one more question? I'm sorry, but something Nicole said actually really depressed me, and so I wanted to hear a little bit more about it, or I shouldn't use that kind of affective language, but I found it challenging to think about the fact that only, it seems like a big problem to me that bridging contacts don't have any effect on social vulnerability, because that's a lot of the context that, that suggests that we should all just huddle in our houses and cultivate our gardens, right? Or what sense do you make of that?
Well, at least you should go into a religious organization.
Well,
I agree with what Laura is saying. I was also very struck by that, so would love to hear more.
Yeah, we were really surprised by that because we actually thought out of all the different types of social capital, that would be the most effective because everybody's taking care of themselves, but then everybody groups up and takes care of each other. We thought, kumbaya, this is wonderful. But that wasn't the case. He actually did similar work with Professor Aldrich in doing the same thing before the United States, and they also found similar results, which I found really sad as well. Right now, we're still trying to wrap our heads around it, but we think that perhaps bonding is just even more so, like, so strong of a thing that people, I guess, don't utilize bridging, or maybe it could also show a need for greater social infrastructure so that these sorts of bonds can be created.
Yeah. Yes. Could I maybe just comment? You obviously have engaged with this much more deeply, but could it also be that different disasters or different stresses would have a different effect, right? I mean, if it is like rescue from an earthquake area where buildings are collapsing, that's maybe different from a different kind of stress. So I'm still also hoping
We're worried.
Just because we're hoping that partially academic institutions, of course, maybe do something for bridging as well. Although maybe it's bonding. Hopefully, it's bonding.
Yeah.
In fact.
Actually, it's great that you mentioned this because we saw a little bit differences in the different cases. We used Japan, for example, and just culturally, the family unit is really, really strong there. So we took into consideration that perhaps because we used Japan as our case, that bonding could have been like exacerbated even more. So it could be different for different places and the different types of disasters they have.
Okay. So we need to transition to the next team. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that would be Heather. Yes.
Do I need my mic? Do I need the mic? Can you hear me? Forget it. Okay. Hi, everybody. Super happy to be here. I am so glad to be introducing this panel and moderating this panel.
And since I introduced Amílcar but did not introduce you, maybe you should introduce yourself first.
I am Heather Street-Salter. I am a professor of history at Northeastern University. So our first panelist is Andrea Keisman, who is a combined major in history and economics, who's going to be talking to us about food sovereignty approaches as a part of Native American resistance.
All right, hi everyone, I'm Andrea and I'm a 5th year student in history and economics, and this is my senior independent study that I'm doing with Professor Nicholas Brown in the history department. So this project was inspired by a class I took in the fall, which is Native American resistance, and for 1 week we learned about food sovereignty, which is pretty interesting to me because I used to be a TA for a food access class. So this topic is such an intersection of an important topic and an interest of mine, so it's been a really great project so far. So, to Native American nations and communities around the world and in the United States, the term sovereignty means something really impactful. It's usually used in a political context in terms of the self-determination and autonomy of indigenous communities on their own self-governments and their own identity. In terms of the United States, when the settler colonial project happened 300 years ago, Native American communities have experienced a lot of hardship since, including the disposition of land, forced assimilation, and other cultural and literal acts of genocide. So in turn, sovereignty has taken many different meanings of Native American resistance and power and strength in self-autonomy and self-determination. Food sovereignty within itself is a different type of resistance, but still asserting sovereignty, and is more of a reclamation of indigenous food systems and a reclamation of indigenous native plants and foodways. So this can include many different things. It can include hunting and gathering and fighting for fishing permits and fighting against extractive industries that could potentially pollute rivers or waterways or land. It includes the seed protection projects and the harvesting and cultivating of seeds and foods. It includes education, rebuilding relationships with Indigenous language, and cooking, and just understanding and appreciating cultural food and traditional food systems. For my project in particular, I'm talking mostly about seed sovereignty, which is the use and protection of seeds and native heirloom seeds. Unfortunately, my font got a little bit messed up in the PDF, but the first project I'm going to be talking about is the Cherokee Nation Seed Bank and Native Plant Site. So this is a picture of it, and this is actually a really great project of an Indigenous nation that is governing its own food sovereignty project. And this project has been around for a long time. It started in 2006 when the Cherokee government was interested in putting their seeds in the Biogen Seed Bank in Antarctica, actually. And when they looked at their seeds and had a herbologist look at them, they found out that none of the seeds they had thought were their ancestors predated the Trail of Tears, or even, pre-colonialization, which was honestly devastating to realize that your ancestors weren't able to bring their seeds from their homeland of Southeast Georgia to their current reservation lands in Oklahoma. So when the Cherokee Nation found this out, they sent the Natural Resources Department to search for their seeds. And it took a lot of different paths. It took museums, it took elders' gardens, it took a famous corn guru in Oklahoma. It took a lot of different resources. But eventually they found over 20 plus ancestral varieties of corn, beans, squash, and tobacco that they were able to plant at their garden. The first year, they weren't sure if they were even going to have plants that germinated because the seed samples they had were scientific. But luckily, they had a 100% germination rate in their first year. They even had excess seeds, which led the Natural Resources Department to give the excess seeds to tribal citizens for free. And this was the birth of the nation's seed bank. Every year since, they have given away excess seed to Cherokee citizens for free, and in 2022 gave over 6,000 seed packets. So even during the pandemic, nothing is stopping the seed bank from getting seeds to its citizens. This has been a huge triumph for the Cherokee Nation and is something that they're really proud of. The White Eagle Cherokee corn was near extinction before this project happened, and so many seeds literally had less than 20 seeds before this project started. It's birthed a native plant site, which has important symbols to Cherokee heritage and culture, and is a learning center for visitors, native and non-native alike, and is something that future generations can go back to and learn about their own ancestral identity, food, and plants. It houses over 100 plants and is lots of acres. The second project that I'm talking about is a more organizational structure that's leading the way for food sovereignty advocacy and education, and that's the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network. This is an organization inside the Native Food Sovereignty Alliance and is a collection of leaders and agricultural organizers from multiple Indigenous nations. Many of them came together and still work together to create food summits, to create educational programming, to make sure Native nations are collaborating, to create seed bank projects, and to revitalize the food sovereignty movement in nations. There are over 526 federally recognized Native American nations in the United States, and the number that are growing food sovereignty projects is expanding rapidly. Like, the research for me was abundant. It's really great to see this project, and they funded so many other smaller projects in individualized nations, and it's a really interesting approach to food sovereignty as a whole. The second part of my paper is focusing on smaller scale projects and community-driven grassroots projects. So as I'm honing in on which projects I want to do, because this is a paper for this semester, I've been researching a variety of different sources of food sovereignty. It's literally gone as far as cookbooks and food trucks to art installations to gardens, and I figured I'd choose these two examples to share because they're near Northeastern. So the first is the Wampanoag Mashpee greenhouses. This is just on Cape Cod and at a Wampanoag farm, and it's a hoop house that they've used to host native plants and native foods. It was built in 2008, and I actually think it's a pretty notable example because it was the irrigation system, the water irrigation system, was put in by Engineers Without Borders or in collaboration with them, which I actually think is a really great example of non-native and native people working together to create things like this. And obviously, gardening and taking care of native food and plants is just so powerful for the current generation and future generations to come to understand the histories. The second example is one we actually visited in our class and is literally basically on Northeastern's campus at the Museum of Fine Arts. And this is called Raven Reshapes Boston by Elizabeth James Perry. She is Mashpee, and she is Wampanoag Algonquin, Aguina, that's it, in the Cape, and she's from Martha's Vineyard. And she created this art installation around the Appeal to the Great Spirit. The Appeal to the Great Spirit is an over 100-year-old statue that was built by a non-native person in Boston, and it's in a kind of settler colonial context. It's not very representative of the indigenous people that lived in Massachusetts, and it's just a statue of a complicated history. So this year in 2021, from September to August, Elizabeth James Perry built this installation that is supposed to remind visitors and viewers of the land that previously existed here before settler colonialism. So as you can see, the art installation is actually in the shape of a horseshoe crab, which is very symbolic to Massachusetts, the Cape, and the indigenous communities that lived here. And then there's corn that is extremely important to indigenous communities in Native America as a whole. The name Raven Reshapes Boston is actually symbolic because according to the Wampanoag Great Myth, the raven was the one that brought corn to their people and then and gave it actually to women. And so the way that they cultivate the corn is in this mound structure, which is shown there, which is also kind of representative of a womb. So this is a very interesting art piece, and I thought it was a good example of food sovereignty that even though it's not eating or cooking food, it's thinking about food and our place in the land and our place on this land. So in conclusion, food sovereignty is a really important topic that's growing and ever expanding around America and the world. There is so much power when people are able to understand the food and culture of their ancestors, especially in the face of dispossession and historical trauma. And I think food sovereignty does this in a really hopeful and exciting way. I think it's just a really powerful example of revitalization and reclamation of personal identity. So just to conclude, I'm going to read this quote from Lauren Spears. She is the executive director of the Tamaqua Museum, which is an hour and a half away from us right now, and she's Narragansett Niantic. So the quote goes, "Sovereignty. It's the idea of passing on those traditions that are a part of healing that intergenerational trauma. The dominant society has oppressed us in a way that has caused poverty and dispossessed us of the land and access. But how we fight back is through food sovereignty and asserting our right to have access to these foods. To go harvesting, to go fishing and shell fishing, to hunt and grow, and to have each generation be a part of that. When you can hold up an ear of heirloom flint corn that is from your ancestors' corn that you're growing today, there's something really, really powerful about that." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. So next, we have Alex Jacobs, who's a combined major in history and international affairs, and she's going to be talking to us about the gross indecency of imperialism, how the British and Irish used sexuality scandals to advance political aims.
Hi, so I'm going to be talking about my research for my history honors in the major project, which, like Professor Street-Salter said, is about how the English and the Irish used homosexuality scandals to advance their respective political aims during late-stage empire. So basically, from the 1880s to the 1910s. They used these scandals in context of the Irish question, with the Irish using them to advance their nationalist movement and the English using them to promote their imperialist and colonialist objectives. So I sort of go through 4 specific case studies in the context of their evolving relationship between the 2 countries, and then also some broader political and social cultural context. So very long, complicated history between the 2 nations I do not have time for right now. So basically, in 1800, that's where I'm going to start, even though it goes way, way back, the 2 parliaments passed the Parole Acts of Union, which made an official union creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And this also created a joint united parliament in London. And then in the aftermath, throughout the 1800s, that was sort of when modern Irish nationalism developed. And it took 2 main forms, the first being radical nationalism. This is sort of very aggressive movements. And then the others were constitutional nationalism. So this is things like the Irish Parliamentary Party and the Home Rule movement. And also over the course of the century, they sort of came to use a ton of different tactics to critique British rule in Ireland and to garner national support. And by the height of the Home Rule movement at the end of the century, they were really focusing on attacking the British on moral grounds, which they were finding a lot of success with. And from there, sort of using scandals and publicizing scandals was kind of a clear next step because of some of these other cultural mindsets at the time. So in the 1880s, there developed this new journalism pretty concurrently in England and Ireland. And basically, this was a form of journalism that is explicitly political. It uses scandal to advance specific aims by extending private individual acts to the immorality of entire groups and institutions. So it was a very good way to critique authority, and both sides figured that out super quickly and used that to their advantage. And it was particularly successful in their ongoing disputes because it also drew explicit parallels between morality, the new sort of ideals of Victorian morality, and the ability to govern well. So there was this idea that moral deviance, and in particular sexual deviance, meant poor governance. And homosexuality directly contradicted so many of these moral norms of the time related to marriage and like duty and work and masculinity, that there was a perception that the public good and the public interest could actually justify the investigation of individuals' homosexuality and the publication of their private acts and what they were doing in their own time, with whoever they wanted to do it with. And we sort of see the intersection of all of these cultural concerns in the mid-1880s with the passage of the Criminal Law Amendment Act, specifically Section 11. The exact text is at the bottom of the screen, but it criminalized all acts of gross indecency between men, regardless, private, public, age, doesn't matter, basically anything. And the sponsor of the amendment at the time argued that it allowed Parliament to arm the guardians of public morality with the full powers to deal with this offense. So that sort of explains how it brings together all of these different cultural concerns. And its passage at the same time as the new journalism was developing meant that there was a massive increase in the public knowledge and discussion of homosexuality as well, and particularly through the scandals of public men of influence. So I talked through 4. They're all listed on the right side of the screen, but I'm just going to talk about 2 right now, the first and the last. So the Dublin Castle scandal is sort of the beginning of all of this. This was the start of the new journalism in Ireland, and it starts with an Irish nationalist named William O'Brien accusing multiple members of the British administration in Dublin of being homosexual. He sort of associated them all with each other. Gustavus Cornwall is the picture on the right. He was the secretary of the General Post Office in Dublin, so he was involved in all of the mail that was going in and out of Ireland. So he's pretty high up in the government, and they cast a very wide net. They accused a lot of people And at the end, there were 8 people on trial, 5 of whom were pretty high up in the government, and there were over 22 witnesses across the trials as well. And they were charged with everything from buggery to attempted buggery to soliciting young men, conspiring, to like corrupt young men, anything like that. There was a wide range. And O'Brien and his associates really established Scandal as an effective political tool because they made this moral battle over homosexuality interchangeable with the political battle of the Irish question and whether the Irish should be able to rule themselves. And really they did that by critiquing the British imperial justification of moral superiority. So they used the fact that both British and Irish men were involved in this scandal to their advantage to make this moral ideological argument that the English's defense of imperialism as civilizing was sort of naive at best and like very hypocritical at worst because they were infecting all of the Irish people as well with their immorality. And they did this through very explicit reporting. They described everything. They put it all in print. They didn't care. That wasn't like a standard of the time. And then they also extended the immoral actions of all of these different individuals to not only entire institutions and governments, but to the nation of England itself. So this sort of set the scene for the new journalism, set the characteristics of the new journalism, but also continued through to like modern political sex scandals today. And it established this dichotomy between Irish nationalism and homosexuality and was part of the inspiration for the Criminal Law Amendment Act in 1885, the next year. So then I talk through a couple of other case studies in my paper and conclude with Roger Casement, who was a British diplomat in the Foreign Office and humanitarian activist, and he was really known primarily for his investigations of human rights abuses in the Congo and in Peru. And sort of as he saw these abuses internationally, he came to really mistrust British imperialism. And he was born in Ireland. He's an Irish nationalist. And that sort of evolved as he was abroad as well. And he was involved in the Easter Rising in 1916. So he basically was trying to gain German military aid, but this was during World War I, so that wasn't taken very well by anybody. And when the English government found out what he was doing, they arrested him when he landed on the shores of Ireland, and then he was actually charged for high treason, executed in London, which makes him a little bit different from all of the other Easter Rising leaders. But the scandal comes in because he left behind a series of diaries that he wrote in 1903, 1910, and 1911 while he was on these human rights humanitarian missions abroad, in which he described his gay sexual exploits in like as much detail as you could imagine. Whatever you think could be recorded about any sort of relationship, he wrote it down in all the time. And basically in the days right before his trial, the British government circulated photos of the diaries to other officials and also to the newspapers. And this was sort of an attempt to block clemency appeals and to remove his ability to be an Irish martyr like all of the other leaders of the uprising. So I'm using him as my sort of transition into my conclusion because it really shows how all of these different mindsets and practices built up over this like 40-year period as the Irish question continually like came closer and closer to the surface. Morally, he caused a lot of problems for literally everybody. All of his sexual relationships crossed class lines. A lot of them involved payment, so they were like prostitution as well. A lot of them were with younger men, and there was this additional colonizer-colonized relationship that the English could not handle. The Irish couldn't handle it either, but the English used it to their advantage. And it's this perfect example of the association between private actions and the ability to govern, because literally even his defense lawyer suggested a connection between his treasonous activities and his homosexuality. So it's really this like intersection and culmination of all of these other ideas and issues that were coming up in the 1880s and 1890s, and showing how they still remain so relevant through into the 20th century. And then I'm also going to talk about him a little bit from more of a historiographical lens in terms of like why we care about this stuff, why we cared about it then, why we still care about it now, and sort of what role identity plays in politics, and like why we don't often talk about it. Because for Keisman, he understood to some extent what it was like to be on the margins, and that's not to say that he didn't have power and privilege, but to be queer and Irish in 1916 was not a great place to be. And that definitely could have impacted his perception of the British imperialism and his willingness to sort of critique it and to really expose imperial abuses effectively. But that legacy has just been kind of completely superseded by a question of whether the diaries were real or not, or just a forgery by the British. So I'm kind of going to go into that a little bit in my paper as well. And then for my conclusions, I'm still figuring some of them out, but really I want to talk about the continued impacts on Irish national identity, in particular, like reconciling seemingly contradictory aspects of identity, like Keisman. I also, if you saw in the previous slide, I'm talking about Oscar Wilde, very similar, like somebody who did a lot of good work and good things, but has, like, didn't get a place in Irish nationalism for a long time, and also how to get out of that mindset of doubling down on imperial power morals as a way to fight for independence. The picture is from 2015, when Ireland became the first country to legalize same-sex marriage by a popular vote, and these are all people celebrating outside of Dublin Castle, and that's a pretty big shift for not a long period of time. So talking about that as well, and then kind of like I already mentioned, the fact that we still do this, we still make all of these equivalencies through modern political sex scandals. The British are like known for their horrible tabloid culture, so how that plays in, and then also a main takeaway about, like I was saying, the political aspects of identity and why we think it's easier to sort of blame and scapegoat those who have contradictory identities rather than to just acknowledge that all identity categories and allegiances are unstable, like inherently. And this idea that societal assumptions will always interact with personal identity, even if you don't do it yourself, somebody else in the opposed to you can and often will, because there's a very established tradition of doing that for political goals. Yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, our last presenter is Lily Zukin, who is a combined major in criminal justice and sociology. She's going to be talking about narrating religiosity in juvenile and young adult parole board hearings.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Lily Zukin, and my project was made possible by the Peak Experiences Award. My project is entitled Narrating Religiosity in Juvenile and Young Adult Life or Parole Board Hearings. We're looking to answer the question. I'm working with Dr. Simon Singer in criminology and criminal justice about how might a parole board candidate's expression of religiosity influence a state's discretionary release practices. This builds off of my Capstone Project, which I did last semester, that was titled In Fear of God, Does Religiosity Make a Difference to Desistance? And so when looking at religiosity, it's not just, when you think of religion, someone that goes to religious services or, kind of participates, it's more of, that is a part of it, but it's also that like spirituality that comes along with it, and like the deep belief that can alter a change depending on on your identity with and your relationship to religion, and then desistance is one's propensity to no longer commit crimes once they're released from prison, and so that they won't recidivate. And so I kind of found that religiosity does make a difference. And one of the big things that comes along with that is social networks. when you're involved in religion, there's a really strong, you likely are part of a congregation of some sort, or you have positive people on the outside that can help you desist from crime. And so this project is looking at more of how, we can use that research about desistance to see how parole board members will perceive desistance or will perceive religiosity, and like if that leads to desistance. And so there's, the aspect of like a candidate's religiosity in the way that they describe their religiosity when they're up for parole board hearings. And then also we're coding how, the actual parole board members are responding to it, whether they're just, not, just saying, okay, next question, or if they're kind of diving deeper into the concepts about religiosity. And so our population are juvenile and young adult lifers who have been incarcerated before they were 21. And so all of them have been sentenced to life. Some of them are life with parole, some are without the opportunity for parole, but that was recently overturned, so now they're able to be up for parole. And then we're using discourse analyses to code these video recorded parole hearings, and so all parole board hearings have the opportunity to be recorded, and so we've been able to get them, and so we're looking at them, and we have a pretty large amount that we're going through, and we're really coding for both the frequency and the intensity of statements. So like how many times are people referencing God or religion or church or, going to mosque or like any types of things that have to do with religion as like more quantitative piece, and then also a qualitative piece of like how intense is it. Like the subject that I'll mention on the next slide talks about having a set time every day where they pray at the same time as their wife who's not incarcerated, and so that they can share that religion and really have that like intense belief about religion. And so I'll go into that. And so I thought this was a good example. This subject was actually granted parole and really mentioned like religion and religiosity throughout their whole thing. It wasn't just when they were asked questions about religion. It also had to do with, they would say, like, God bless you all and stuff like that, just to people. It was just a part of their like everyday vernacular. And so this subject, first he was asking, so when you're up for parole, you have to have a plan about what your next steps are going to look like. They're not just going to kind of say you're out, you're out. And so he was asking to be paroled to a long-term residential facility as a kind of like halfway house type situation. And so it was a religious organization, and so he needed to complete steps throughout the organization, then also participate in like the religious activities while there. And also in a parole hearing, you can have up to 5 supporters of your parole present, and one of them for this client or this subject was his pastor, and both the pastor and the subject mentioned that he will be continuing to participate within his, this church when he is released, and so he's able to participate in this type of in this church while he's incarcerated. I don't know if I did that. There you go. Nice. All right. But so he's able to participate while he's incarcerated, and then also, he'll be able to go to the larger congregation and participate with, the larger community once he's released. And then another thing that I thought was really amazing. So this subject was, pretty high up in like the gang hierarchy that he was in. And so then once he got into prison, he actually disassociated with the gang. But he met other members of opposing gangs through his church service, and they worked together to actually build propose a program to get youth away from joining, prison or joining gangs and kind of getting down the lifestyle that he did. And so I just thought that was really, impactful that he met these people through church, and they kind of had that shared identity of church and of their religion, and were able to look past some really intense things that 2 rival gangs can go against, and work together for something. And so I mentioned that he also prays at the same time as his wife daily, and so they have that shared belief in that shared time where they practice religion and know that the other one is also doing it. While they can't be together, they're able to still pray at the same time. And his wife actually would email or mail the service notes that she took at each service that she would attend to him, so that he would be able to participate in religiosity with people on the outside and not just when the pastor was able to come visit. And so as far as takeaways, so the desistance literature that I looked at really indicated that like a narrative of religiosity can enable hope and like an identity that enables language for redemption and forgiveness. And so, there's that shift in identity that's really important. And I think, the parole board likes to see that there's a changed person in front of them, someone that's accepting, accountability for their actions. And also, I think it's important, a lot of people, being able, you have to, forgive when you've been incarcerated for a long time, especially when you started out so young, being able to not only like forgive the situation that, got you down this negative path, whether it's like lack of, resources or whatever, but also being able to forgive yourself, like as a way of like accepting accountability. And so we're hoping to, direct or to expand research and understanding about desistance and how parole board members perceive like rehabilitative efforts of juvenile and young adult lifers, as like rehabilitation is one of the like big tenets of criminal justice. And so seeing how they're actually perceived is important, as we learn about them in our classes and stuff, but kind of seeing how they are in action. And so this, this research is relevant to understanding state discretionary release practice and how to best facilitate reentry of young offenders. And so, learning that if having a strong sense of religiosity helps, then we can kind of see once people reenter society how we can utilize that as like a mitigating factor for their continued desistance.
Should Heather, I know you have to leave. Would you like to pass the baton to me? Or
I don't have to leave until 4:25.
Okay.
And then I do have to leave.
All right. So yes, if everyone from panel 2 could cluster around on either side of the TV hearth there, then Heather, you may facilitate.
Can I ask a question first, since I'm facilitating? This question is for you, Lillian, and I don't mean to sound cynical at all, but is there at all a sense that any of this religiosity is performative?
Yeah, so that's a pretty huge thing that we're like looking into, and so that's kind of why instead of just looking at the the statements of the subject that's up for the candidate that's up for parole, we're also trying to look at how people are reacting to what they're saying, because luckily reading a transcript is can be a little dry, and so we have the actual videos so you can kind of hear when people are just saying. I was listening to one today where someone was like, I go to church, I love church. And it kind of seemed a little like, I don't know, it just kind of seemed like you're trying to add up like the word count a little. And then there's also, but there's also like, people that, like that one that I mentioned, who, has like the set time that they're, going to church with their wife. And so, we're trying to kind of, that's also why we're tracking like the quantity of, to see the frequency of how often people are, discussing it, because, if it's just like a one-off, maybe it might not be a huge part of their identity, but just kind of to see how that is.
Other questions?
I suppose I could ask the sources question. So I guess this is for everyone. Like, what sources so with your project it makes sense, right? Like it's like the transcripts, but you could say more. So yeah, like what sources did you use, and like for example, did you actually get to read those journals that went from Casement and everything? So yeah, everyone, please, yeah.
Go first, yeah. I'm doing a lot of newspapers because they're scandals. They were published in newspapers. So a lot of newspaper databases. The journals are published. It's been a long, long time to like get them to that point. So yes, I have a copy of them. And then it sort of depends for each of the case studies. Like for Dublin Castle, actually a lot, it was so shocking to them that they had a lot of the court transcripts destroyed like immediately. So they only exist in the newspaper reports. But then for others, like Oscar Wilde's court transcript has been published multiple times. So I'm using those, like that for his, but for Dublin Castle, it's much more focused on the newspapers. So it sort of depends on which one.
Yeah. Mine started with a book, which was just Indigenous Food Sovereignty by Elizabeth Hoover, which can lead you on a path to 100 different topics in food sovereignty, which was an awesome place to start. And then going from that, I read 2 more books, Braiding Sweetgrass, and then As Long as the Grass Grows. But a lot of my research, because the projects that I'm looking at are contemporary, is just kind of online. A little bit of academic journals, a lot of organizations on websites. There's so many, like even YouTube videos, like there's just a ton of material out there. But I think I got a lot of the historical context that I think I would have needed about this project from my class. And like this is a paper like with my professor for that class. So there hasn't been too much like deep source historical material, because in the introduction I think it's kind of inferred that that's who my audience is. But yeah.
It sounded like you might have done some interviews. Is that not the case?
I've emailed.
Seems like you could.
I've definitely emailed a bunch of organizations and tried to figure out, oh, I saw this project was happening in 2014. Like, it's 2020. Like, does this still exist? Like, I would like to know. But it's a slow process to get a response. And also, I think, like, as a non-native college student studying, like, Native American studies, like, I get a lot of advice from my professor, obviously, but, like, I don't expect anyone to teach me, I'm just trying to take what's out there and piece it together on an outside lens, I think.
Yeah, so for my Capstone Project, which was last semester, which is like what I'm building this off of, I mostly stuck to like academic journals and academic, studies and ethnographies, just to kind of really get like a deep dive into, individual stories. And then this, we're really just focusing on those video recorded parole hearings and, using the transcripts to code accordingly.
Can I officially now hand it over to you?
You
Laura?
may.
And can I just say, terrific job.
And thank you, Professor Street Salter, for joining us. And I will facilitate. I also do have a question myself. I'm so struck. It often happens just coincidentally, or maybe I just put together a really coherent program, but that the first papers you hear at these kinds of things sort of produce a set of terms that you then start applying to everything. And I'm struck by how many of these papers fall into are either about social capital or social infrastructure, right? It's like everyone is talking in some ways about sort of how groups navigate through and are perceived in the world and respond to various kinds of disasters. I'm actually still getting my mind around the concept of a juvenile lifer, which really makes me want to dive under my chair. That seems like a man-made disaster. But my question, or one of my questions was actually for Alex, and I'm struck by how incredibly contemporary this material is, because as we speak, I don't know if anyone is following the hearings for the proposed Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, but there has been a pretty, it's not even the Republicans who are not supportive of her candidacy have been trying to associate her with child pornography. So actually this kind of encompasses everybody, because they're saying that, so they're trying to create a sex scandal, right? And one of the most kind of, hot button, that this, because now just being regular homosexual isn't quite enough. Well, in some cases it is, but child pornography really occupies that moral panic space. So they're trying to affiliate her with child pornography, and particularly in the criminal justice space by saying that she is soft on perpetrators, right? Which turns out actually statistically not to be true. But
has a whole racist history.
Yeah. But so I guess I just was wondering in some ways, you addressed this a little, Alexa, but how do you, to me, it does seem sort of important to know that this is not a new thing, that it has this whole history that like we create spoiled identities for people, to use that term. I don't know if we have any sociologists in the room, but how do you like help people understand that? Do you know what I'm asking?
Yeah. I don't know, because it's been happening for so long, and it's just kind of like we always find a new place to put it. Kind of like you said, like being just homosexual isn't enough in a lot of places anymore. But I think the biggest thing is I think one of the reasons why I like history so much is that when we know more about when we know more about the past, we can kind of at least see where our problems today started from. And I think maybe if we acknowledge that it has sort of hit so many different groups of people over time, and that it's still impacting us today, like maybe hopefully that helps people understand. That's how history helps me understand, but yeah.
We have time for one more question before the next panel, if there's anyone. Otherwise, we can thank our panelists very much. Our last moderator, but I will introduce you, and you can introduce. So for our final panel today, thank you to our panelists so far. What do we have going on here? Oops. For our final panel today, we have Associate Professor Kevin Drakulich of Criminology and Criminal Justice to moderate. And Kevin, please take it away. And I should say that this is the moment where you have a change in your program. So we have one presenter whom Kevin will introduce.
Which means we have, a robust amount of time for questions.
That's right. And we can take questions at the end for all of the panels. So.
Well, Ella can just come up here as well, as I find the title of her presentation.
You know what? I can help you.
I showed up late, so I did not get one of the very fancy. It's my great pleasure to be here. I'll take off my mask. Apologize for the mask beard. It's one of the horrible consequences of the pandemic. So it's my great pleasure to be here. First of all, to catch some really great conversations from the last panel, which I didn't even know. I didn't know Lily was here. I knew a little bit about her work, so that was really great. But my official duty here is to introduce another one of our really great students, Ella Cohen, who I'm super excited is going to talk to you today about some of the work she's been doing with the Shannon Community Safety Initiatives in a talk titled Shannon Community Safety Initiative, COVID Setbacks and Partner Reflection.
Hi everybody. I also had to come a little bit late because I was working on this all day, like the actual project, not the presentation, not that last minute. But I'm going to be talking a little bit about my current co-op. So I'm a research assistant with Northeastern and UPenn, working on the statewide reporting piece of the Shannon Community Safety Initiative, which is a grant from the Massachusetts government, the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security. So I'm going to explain a little bit about what the context of that is, and then a little bit about our project. And it's still ongoing, so I don't have any official takeaways yet, but I'm just going to talk about being a first-time researcher and that sort of experience. So I wanted to just first explain what the Shannon Community Safety Initiative is, or Shannon CSI. So it's a Massachusetts state government. These are some numbers from this last reporting year. This was a lot of what I was doing for the first 2 months of the year, was seeing how many youth were affected by the grant. It's targeted at reducing youth gang violence, but it's trying to be that preventative piece, a proactive piece, rather than having to intervene. So in total grant funding for 2021, there was over $9.7 million given. There were over 15,000 youth served, despite COVID obstacles, which is a lot of what our current qualitative study is based on. I'll get into that later. And then an average investment of over $584 per youth. So you can think of what kind of difference that makes, especially in just the after school setting, just meals, things like that. So it's just been insane to see these numbers. I think I'm so used to hearing about, governments being defunded and good programming being defunded. So it's crazy to see like a number like over $9.7 million. And then this funding is kind of spread out across 5 Shannon strategy areas. So there's like the case management piece, connecting people to social services, community mobilization, so having community meetings, that sort of thing, education and employment, a lot of like high set test taking, a lot of internship connecting, then youth development and recreation, which is like a really large piece, after school programming, swimming, horseback riding, I'll talk about that later. And then there's also a suppression piece. So because it's youth gang violence, the police are involved, but I've been surprised just about like some of the services that they have, been involved with, and how people are approaching the topic, especially amidst COVID and amidst like the Black Lives Matter movement and all this like misconduct, how some of these like sites in Massachusetts are working on police youth relationships has been interesting for me to learn about, just because that wasn't a perspective that I had thought of really throughout the pandemic. And this is all made possible because the Shannon Community Safety Initiative works with over 140 partners. So these range from like YMCAs, YWCAs, Boys and Girls Clubs, things like that, but also like kickboxing gyms and pools, mentorship programs, weightlifting. So it's great to see the diversity of programs that the initiative and like the grant funding goes to. So I'm going to talk about this like Shannon Spotlight study, which is what we're engaging with right now. It's just about COVID and like the resiliency that's been like forced upon these nonprofit bodies, a lot of these nonprofit bodies, but also just like the creativity that they've had in their pivots. So just like a general overview of the objectives. One of the main objectives was just to have greater communication with the partners, since there are over 140 and we have one statewide research body like at Northeastern and UPenn kind of. It's just been like to get to better know these sites spread across the state. And my colleagues have talked about like how much they've just learned about the day-to-day service. So, and obviously I'm learning a lot because I'm new, but it's been great to like see that that's a widely felt, thing that we've the thing that we've gotten so far. And then also having this like qualitative COVID data, what nonprofits have done, how those pivots have gone, maybe what they might keep for the future, and then establishing a new tradition. So we're trying to do these like spotlight studies every year with a different theme. As the statewide research partner, since Northeastern is kind of like stepping into this role for the first time. There's like a transition last year. So far, we started with like an IRB approval process, both here and at UPenn, which took a while, but I wasn't a co-op for some of that time, so I escaped it. And then we conducted interviews with 37 partners. A lot of these were like executive directors, program directors, youth, workers. Then transcribing and deleting audio files, which had to do with the IRB process. So that was a lot of like last month was a transcription. It was my first time doing it, so great experience. And then right now we're in the qualitative coding process, so coding for COVID responses, the timeline of when they stayed open, how they stayed open. And then we'll eventually have a presentation to local action research partners. And then we'll also have a published report for EOPS, like the executive office, and these partners to use to show their like beneficiaries, for funders, that sort of thing. So I just wanted to like briefly go over like my personal experience and a reflection. This quote I found when I was coding, and it just like, I think it's really like a good, a testament to what these nonprofits have had to do. So it says, if I knew someone in it for the profit world and they're working late into the night on something and they shut it down, they're shutting down numbers and spreadsheets. And when we shut down, we're shutting down another kid that we're serving. So I think that provides the constant drive for us to keep moving. So these like nonprofits like feed kids, they're like emergency childcare. They can't exactly close their doors. So just hearing about them, closing for maybe just 1 month during the initial 2020 lockdown and then having to pivot, doing everyday service, immediately like getting Zoom for a whole organization. It's been, unfortunate that they've had to make those changes, but it's been so impressive. And the fact that they're doing it with the same amount of funding as before. So this first piece is just about like gaining insight into direct service, day-to-day activities. It's been a lot of insight for me as a new co-op, but also like, as I said, my colleagues have also talked about how they just didn't know that all this was going on at these 140 sites. So this was just a quote from the Boys and Girls Club, and sorry that it's cut off a little bit on the edge, but it's just, I thought this would be like cool for you guys to see, just for context. So the Boys and Girls Club, they were talking about having a music recording studio because youth are interested in recording music. They have like job interviews, resume builders. They also have lifeguard certification because that's a job that some of the youth wanted, and it's a high-paying job during the summer. So it's just interesting to see that they're like really building these activities around what the youth want to do. They're not saying like, I think it would be good for you to like have this creative writing session that maybe the youth wouldn't be into. They're like, we're going to teach you how to be a lifeguard and make $20 an hour in the summer. We're going to get you a recording studio and like set you up. So I think that's really cool. And then another great partner, the Cambridge Arts Center. Again, there's like multiple hats that they're wearing. Licensed childcare center, teen programming, so like a whole range of ages, creative youth development, arts programming, murals all over the city, the longest running youth film festival in the country. This is all on a nonprofit budget. And then, you know, they were talking about just having to constantly grant write. You know, Shannon is a big help, but that, you know, it doesn't cover everything that they're doing, obviously. So it's just so interesting to see this sort of thing. And then what I was talking about earlier, like the Lowell Police Department, in their interview, they were talking about like a horseback riding program that they were doing with youth to build like police-youth relationships, partnering with a farm and having officers go with a group every day to like learn how to clean stables, groom horses. It was like something that I never would have thought of, and something that like it is reasonable that police-youth relationships are bad. Like there is a way breaking of trust, and especially with like this higher concentration of like youth of color in the programming, like yeah, that makes perfect sense. So it's just interesting to see like how this program is going. I mean, it's not really what we're focusing on per se, but it's just been interesting for me to like read. And then again, like the power of pivoting what they've done. This is one of our partners, Project Right, and they had to pay for like 2 or 3 hours out of the week to like create their own community center because their community center closed down. This was something that they hadn't done before. They had like a basketball league that people could come to. So they like fulfilled this role that wasn't even theirs, just because they knew that they had to like continue being a place for youth to go, especially when they were doing all their school from home and maybe not in like the safest home environment or the most like focused home environment. And then the Boys and Girls Club of Metro South was talking about providing 400 to 500 meals every single night, not just sandwiches, like hot meals to anybody 0 to 18 and their families, which like 400 to 500 meals every single night that are hot meals throughout like 2021, March 2021 through the summer. Like that's something that they hadn't done before. So like what a pivot. Yeah, I just thought like insane. So great, but insane. So those are like the major takeaways just from the data, but also just for me, this is more personal, I guess, but I didn't know that there would be, like I'm currently trying to combine human services and public health and criminal justice, so I didn't know that there would be research like in these fields. So it's great to know that you can get involved in research no matter what your major is or your like interests. Advocate for yourself. I was like a first-time researcher with Northeastern and UPenn. Like I was scared, and I was doing coding and like transcribing for the first time with people who research as a career and for their whole life. So I was very intimidated, but I know how to read. I know how to highlight things. Like, you've got this. You can do this. And then just that research isn't stoic. I think like listening to these conversations, they're very emotional. These direct service providers are very close to their youth. It's like a lot of laughing in interviews, a lot of like emotion. So that was just an interesting takeaway that I'm sure that you guys have also known. But yeah, it's just a little like personal piece. But thank you.
And we are always looking to hear specifically about research co-ops, so I'm hoping that one of the people in the room who might be charged with remembering things can remember that we heard about this.
Yeah, and it's like a newer co-op too, so.
That's awesome. I definitely think it's something we want to hear more about. We do have time for questions.
Yes, absolutely.
And I thought we could take a little time to ask Ella questions, and then since we do have a little extra time, I would love to hear if any of our people who presented today, not that you haven't already done a wonderful job, but if you have any questions for each other. So, yeah.
I also, as a general question for everyone afterwards, I missed some of the beginnings of the first panel, so you may have talked about this, but was wondering whether anyone was thinking about turning this into like an undergraduate honors in the major research project, which could be a fun next step if you're already engaged in research and doing things. These are, it's another fun way to, take it even more, especially, in your case, I'll let you go from kind of working on a group project to kind of taking some piece of that, right, and, taking the lead on it yourself. I'll set that question aside for later. To start, I can ask the first question, at least, which is, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, Trissha, question for you, but just as a starting place, you talked about all the different kind of pieces of the project, the interviewing and the transcribing and the meeting with people, etc. I wasn't quite sure, like, which piece of those did you get to do? Have you gotten to be involved in all of that?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
So I came in January, but this project was kind of like in the works at the end of last year, and they'd actually started, like, they'd done 2 interviews in the December of 2021. So they, the developing of the questions was something that like a PhD student here did with the project. So I wasn't involved in that. But like I've had conversations about it with the team. And then I've sat in on interviews in the IRB. I wasn't like approved to do the interviews, but I was like CITI trained, so I could like be there, read through them, like deal with the data. But I've like sat in on interviews, and then I was able to like be the major part of the transcription process, and then now coding. It's split between like me and a professional researcher, and then like a PhD student here that's doing it for her, like
a professional researcher in training,
and somebody who can read, and somebody. No, yeah. It's so that's like something that I'm having a big like hand in now, and then I'll have a hand in. Me and the researcher, the PhD student, are working on the presentation, so that's something that I'll directly work on, and then also the report will be something that like my data is going into, but I know that the PhD student like kind of wants to take the wheel with that just because it is her like passion project, but I work very closely with her. But those are the parts. The part that I wasn't involved in was like the question generation and like being the actual interviewer.
Right, but you've not been involved in the rest of it.
Great. Yes.
And I wonder about that, given your discussion at the end, that these are both, they can be really powerful and emotional experience of being in interviews with people doing direct service work. They can be really positive, as you said, but I mean, they can also be negative in really intense ways. I mean, they're dealing with the, the problems raised by broader inequalities in society. They are there at that, cleavage, right, trying to fill in gaps.
Definitely.
So it can also be intense in a difficult way. So there's, mental health care components even for the researchers.
Yeah, mental health is definitely one of the biggest themes that we're finding, just like as a challenge for youth at each site, which is understandable. But also, what you're talking about, I was in an interview like a couple weeks ago, and the interviewee was talking about just like burnout and talking about how, like, of course, direct service is her job and she loves doing it, but she was like, sometimes the data collection piece, I understand why it's important, and I understand why projects like this will be like beneficial even to us to show to our, youth and families and to our funders and other grant writers. But she was just talking about how like she was very burnt out on explaining things, and I was like, I understand. And it's hard when like you are in that director's seat and have to like do a lot of interviews like that, especially when you're applying to multiple grants. So also that sort of emotion was there.
Actually, that's a great segue. I wonder, and again, we will let you go soon, but I'm wondering if we could just ask all our presenters who are still here just to go up to the front for one more time and gather around that TV card.
We're running against you, probably, right?
And because I really also, I think, reference some emotion, that is provoked by some of the interviews. And so I guess the question, and I think maybe, okay, wait a sec. I think maybe, Andrea, you could move a little bit to your right so that you're not in front of the...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. But so I guess the question I just wanted to throw out to everybody, anyone who wants to answer, and you're certainly not obliged to, but like, I'm wondering if other people want to reflect on their emotional relationship to the research. Well, I mean, like, you know, for the first presentation, Uta and I were both really bummed, right, about hearing about the lack of bridging social cohesion. I'm just wondering, you know, what other kinds of less intellectual and more emotional responses people might have that they find appropriate to talk about, if any.
I guess since you referenced my presentation, interestingly, I was thinking in a more hopeful manner when looking at the results, because I thought, well, then we sort of know what sort of policies will and won't work, or are likely to work and not work, and then we can give these to their communities and help them create these sorts of events and this sorts of social infrastructure that will actually be at least proven through our study to be more helpful. And just by working with social capital in the first place, I never really thought that you could quantify things like social relationships. And so that has really energized me to try to explore social capital in different disciplines as well. And hopefully there'll be more hopeful results.
That's great. Hope is an emotion. Anyone else?
I think for me, like, it makes me mad, but in a good way, like in a fired up kind of way. I also did an honors in the major project for my international affairs major that was about LGBT refugees, and a lot of that comes from the British. And I think, obviously, they're not the same project, they're not the same topic at all, but it does just, like, it all goes so far back into, like, all of the problems that we have today, and it's so upsetting to, like, read people's, like, personal details in the newspaper, but it also, like, anger is a good motivator to address, like, our current problems. And I think sort of, like, thinking about the connections between my two projects, like, it's motivating, I think, to me.
Yeah, Trissha.
For my research project, I got to go to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC and work with the museum director there because I needed to access research about Jewish migration patterns during the 1900s. And it was just obviously a very depressing experience, you know, going to any museum like that. But especially kind of the modern implications of how refugees are politically used, especially like considered the situation in Ukraine and how Black and brown refugees are being received and taken into camps differently. So it was a cool thing to watch overlap, but at the end of the day, it's also very just like sobering, like history repeats itself kind of way. Yeah.
I would say following up with that, like for my project, I have been like pretty free form of like looking at what I want to look at and studying what I want to study. But I had the opportunity to travel like recently to Albany and to Toronto, and they have absolutely amazing, especially Toronto, the Royal Ontario Museum had like the best First Nations exhibit I had ever seen. Like we spent hours there like researching and stuff. So like I think it's cultivated like a new excitement for me in this study and like hope, and like seeing it in that museum, especially like the way they structured the exhibit and talked about like indigeneity and Native American like history as modern was so cool. So I think it's given me the opportunity to be more excited about going to museums and like digging and research and reading, and yeah, I hope to carry that.
That's awesome. So maybe the emphasis is on the creative. I mean, what you're all showing is that even when the questions are complex, the responses can still really be creative. So do you think, Kevin, that on that note we should give our presenters a round of applause, and thank you so much for being with us, and please feel free to come back tomorrow from 2 to 3:30 and hear some of your peers present their work if you are free. So thank you again.